How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Well, welcome, folks, to the Dr. Joe Show. It's me, the same guy who's been here. Do you know that we're in our 9th year of doing the show? So next year, our 10th anniversary, who knows what'll happen? But for our audience, thank you so much for sticking with us all these years. We've had so many remarkable guests, and we're always looking at the I Am approach, the idea that we're doing the best we can. Let's change this paradigm away from illness and pathology. And even when we don't agree with someone, let's try to understand who they are and why they do what they do. And that really gets us to tonight's guest. Let me first tell you know that our guest, I have known Jonathan for over half a century now, because we went to high school together and we were just reminiscing how we graduated. It's okay, in 1976, 50 years ago. So let me introduce Jonathan Kahn, a professor of law and biology at Northeastern University. He's been on the show before, the author of Race in a Bottle, The Story of Beidel, and we'll figure out what that is, and Racialized Medicine in a Post-Genomic Age, and Race on the Brain, What Implicit Bias Gets Wrong About the Struggle for Racial Justice, both published by Columbia University Press. And his new book is what we are going to be talking about tonight: The Uses of Diversity, How Race Has Become Entangled in Law, Politics, and Biology. Jonathan Kahn, professor, welcome to the Dr. Joe Show again.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here. And actually, we go back to middle school, I think. So
Yes, we do.
Junior high. So
Yes, we do. Yeah, we
even before
graduated
high
in
school.
70s. That's right. We were together in
Yeah.
junior high school. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, listen,
Yes.
really interesting. Tell me, first of all, why this book, especially right now, in such a critical time for us? Why now?
Well, as I was writing my previous book, I really and that this was sort of like in the teens, in the 20 teens. It struck me how much the language of diversity had become so pervasive in our culture, in our
Oh,
political culture, in our legal culture, but also in this area where I also work, which is in biomedicine, biomedical research, biotechnology. That everywhere that diversity there was just everywhere. It was like the became what I sort of call a master narrative for talking about all sorts of things in society. And there's nothing wrong about that, but I was noticing about how it just seemed pervasive. But what really, as I was doing my work in this area, what I also noticed often happening is, because diversity is such a kind of flexible concept, and adaptable, it's used in spaces um, like law and politics to talk about, oh, we need a diverse workforce, or we need a diverse, incoming college class, affirmative action, that kind of diversity. Where it's talking about diversity as very much a kind of social and cultural phenomenon. We want diverse viewpoints. We want, diverse people in the workforce.
so
But
so
at the same,
diverse, so
oh, sorry.
diversity then meant like different color skin, different
Well,
socioeconomic status.
so
I mean,
in wait, so in the area of things like, you know, where corporations have, like the DEI realm, right, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it can mean, I mean, people, it can mean racial diversity, it can mean gender diversity, but also, again, in things like college admissions too, it can mean geographic diversity.
yeah.
It can mean viewpoint diversity. It can mean economic diversity, trying to get more students into, expensive elite institutions, more students from poorer backgrounds. But it really grew out of the concept of affirmative action, which was really grounded in race.
Mm.
And but where it's also being used is in biomedical research, where there is this very powerful push, especially beginning around 2010, 2011, to get what people are calling about sort of diverse cohorts, diverse groups of people for clinical trials or for creating massive genetic databases to try to propel biomedical research sort of towards the promised land of curing cancer or whatever, great new biomedical intervention we might have. And their diversity um, involves this is where I first noticed where I call this sort of entanglement, where
Mm.
their diversity can mean people talk about genetic diversity, but they also talk about these racial or ethnic categories of diversity. And then that language also I realized was creeping into the law and politics realm as well. And so what I mean is that what I try to explore in the book is these sort of almost like these two strands of diversity. One is this diversity understood as a sort of biological concept, a genetic or biological concept. I mean, there is, biological diversity in the world, biodiversity, or, genetic diversity. But there's also the kind of diversity we talk about in DEI, which is social diversity, which is not grounded in biology. And so where I start the book is back in the early 70s, where I found these two concepts of diversity really have their foundation, where there's this discussion of the nature of biological diversity in relationship, particularly to race, and um, racial diversity in relationship to affirmative action. And I can sort of tell that story if you
Yeah,
want, but
please
okay.
go ahead. Tell that story.
So where I started the book is in the early 1970s. There is this a molecular geneticist named Richard Lewontin, who is one of the sort of like the guiding lights of genetics in the 20th century. And in 1972, he writes an article called "The Apportionment of Human Diversity," which becomes a sort of foundational bedrock of genetic understanding of scientific understanding of genetic diversity for the remainder of the 20th century ever since. And people talk about a lot the idea today of, oh, race is a social construct. It's not biological, it's social. And we can get into that, as our talk conversation progresses. But there is this phrase that a lot of people who talk about, oh, race is social, use, where they say, which is accurate, where they say there is actually more genetic diversity within a racial group than there is between different racial groups. And that goes back to this paper by Lewontin saying, which essentially provides the foundation for what we talk about today, is that genetically we are all 99.5% the same.
Right.
And his work was the one that sort of laid that foundation. So at the same time that he's writing that article, the year after he writes that article, he comes to Harvard and he's sitting at his office at the Harvard Museum of Natural History in Cambridge. And while he's there, that fall in 1973, Archibald Cox, who was a sort of scion of the East Coast establishment, a very prominent and powerful lawyer, had been named as the Watergate special prosecutor um, to investigate Watergate and to investigate Nixon. And in the fall of '73 was the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon fired Archibald Cox because he was putting too much pressure on him. And so Cox comes home to Harvard. And so he's in Cambridge in the fall of 1973, and he starts working on what's called an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in a case that's working its way up to the Supreme Court that involves affirmative action in higher education. And it was a case that ultimately actually wasn't the court declared the case moot ultimately, but it essentially the arguments he developed for that case became the foundation of a subsequent brief he submitted in the case of Bakke versus Board of Regents of California in 1977, which sort of like just as the Lewontin piece is sort of like the foundational touchstone of how we talk about diversity in genomics. Archibald Cox's brief in Bakke versus Board of Education versus Regents of California, his brief there became the basis for the controlling Supreme Court opinion in that case, and that opinion became the foundational touchstone of how we talk about diversity in the social, political, educational, and business realms.
So,
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 and
so,
that's sort of political diversity, and they're a couple hundred yards apart from each other at this time,
yeah.
but they're writing these foundational documents at that
Uh,
point.
So we're going to continue this, but in terms of the amicus brief and the friends of the court, I'm very honored to have friends of the Dr. Joe Show, and they are our sponsors. So what I'd like to do is take our little amicus brief now, a brief pause, and hear from the friends of the Dr. Joe Show. We'll be right back with Jonathan Kahn and this fasting discussion. We'll be right back. And we are back. We're back here. Thank you. 95.9 FM WATD live streaming the Dr. Joe Show. We're here with Jonathan Kahn, professor of law and biology at Northeastern, talking about his new book, The Uses of Diversity, How Race Has Become Entangled in Law, Politics, and Biology. And it is so entangled, even though we as human beings are one group, 99.5% genetically similar. We're so focused on this little bit. So we were talking off air a bit about continuing the Archibald Cox story and this, the amicus brief. Tell me more. How has that influenced who we are
Yeah,
now and what
so
we're doing?
yeah, so just as sort of like, Lewontin was talking about how, we're 99.5% the same genetically. But then, there is diversity, but it's not apportioned according genetic diversity, but it's not apportioned in the human species according to race.
Right.
That's
So
not how,
it's not a racial thing.
there is biological difference. It's just
Sure.
not based on racial difference.
Right. But there's
Those are
biological
two
difference,
different things.
and there's biological difference in all of us. We
Right.
all look a little different, but we have two hands, two feet.
Yeah.
We have the similarities of species.
Well, and as you and I can say after 50 years of knowing each other, right? You're biologically different from who you were 50
Yeah,
years ago. I mean,
that's
it's just like
so
you
true.
yourself change, right?
It's
So,
true. There was that
yeah.
line, remember years ago, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." Remember that line?
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
find at my age, my waste is a terrible thing to mind,
Nothing to mind, right?
but
Yeah, yeah,
but go
yeah.
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. But so there's that. And then I was talking about Archibald Cox and the idea of diversity and affirmative action, where there, and that's where he was talking about, there's this whole question of legally, is it okay or under what circumstances can you take race into account? And back in the 70s, what the Supreme Court said is you can take race into account in like in college admissions, um, if you think of it as just one type of diversity. And this was the winning argument. The race is just one type of diversity that college administrators can think about when they're sort of like putting together a class. And that's what I was saying earlier. It's like you might want somebody who's from, race X, but you also might want somebody who is from the Midwest or somebody who can play the elbow. And this is this concept of that type of diversity. But of course, one of those characteristics is race, which again has always been entangled with the idea of biology. So what I do is over the sort of, in the Bakke case and for Cox, there was no entanglement of race with genetics there. And with Lewontin, he's very, very consciously disentangling race from genetics. But over the following 50 years, these sort of concepts, the social understandings of diversity and the biological understandings of diversity, particularly in relationship to race, sort of do this dance around each other. And sometimes they become entangled in very problematic ways that can either lead to reinforcing incorrect and dangerous ideas that race is somehow biological, or or get in the way of sort of social attempts to ameliorate historical racial injustice.
Mm.
And so if you're not dealing with these categories carefully, so we have to learn how to deal with these categories carefully and productively. And that's sort of what in telling this story, I want, it's sort of a cautionary tale to give people examples of when and how these categories have been used productively and when and how they've been used problematically, to sort of provide some guidance on, like, moving forward, we should think about how we use these categories so that we don't make these similar kinds of mistakes.
But we're
Um,
so prone to them as human beings, this idea that my group is better than your group. I mean, this goes back, this is biologically ancient. Um, and we still perpetuate. But you were still talking about ameliorating the social injustice. How have we been using this to say racism didn't really happen, or you know, the bias wasn't really there? Is that what you're talking about? That we're making
well,
excuses for ourselves?
no, I mean, sometimes, right, in its most pernicious forms, it can take the shape of, I mean, again, going back to the same period in the early 70s, but then coming back again in the 90s, and then making a comeback sort of today, are ideas that, there are these genetic differences between the races that show, for example, that African American people, are have lower, genetically based, have lower IQs than white people or Asian people,
Right, and
right? And
this
that's
is the danger of this argument, right? And this is
yeah,
racism, basically saying my group is better than your group,
right,
and
and
therefore
yeah.
you deserve to be socioeconomically restricted or not let into different. Is that the
Right,
argument?
it's both, that sort of like the reason why sort of like my group's on top and your group's on the bottom is because of, it's meant to be that way. Nature
Right.
says it's meant to be that way.
Yeah.
And or the idea that because nature puts you on the bottom, we shouldn't do anything to help lift you up.
Hmm.
Because even if you show that there are differences between people, say again, IQ based differences, although, IQ is, how exactly you measure intelligence is ridiculously complicated. But even something as simplistic as IQ or reductive as IQ, you can say, okay, maybe some people have higher IQs on average than others. But the thing is, what do you do about it? In other
Hmm.
words, do you make arguments that, well, we as a society should make an effort to sort of like help everybody? Or do we use that as a justification for maintaining the hierarchy? Right.
Because we don't want to dilute the really
Right.
good genes with the bad.
Right. And
Is
that's,
that right?
yeah, I mean, where you're seeing that today is, again, sort of, so in the 70s, there were also people at Harvard, again, in the same, right next door to Lewontin, who were beginning to make these arguments about genetically based differences in intelligence. And Lewontin was very much opposed to them. They came back in the 1990s with a sort of infamous book called The Bell Curve, which got a lot of play in the 90s, which was essentially an argument to do away with the welfare state. But the part of the argument was, because that there are, especially these race-based genetic differences in intelligence, we shouldn't make any effort. We should do away with any sort of social supports for poor people, particularly poor Black people. Um, and then it comes back again in the current administration, where you have Donald Trump talking about genetics a lot. He
Nah.
has what he calls a racehorse theory of genetics, the idea that some people are bred to be better than others. You hear it how he talks about, S-hole countries and the kinds of countries that should allow to, it's very much bound up with immigration, because the immigration is not just, the concern about immigration is not just about, um, getting the worst of the worst out and getting, dangerous criminals out of the country. Nobody has an argument with that. But the targeting of the immigration um, is, at essentially racialized groups,
Yeah.
right? Because he wants more people from Scandinavia or white South Africans to come in. It's very much about this idea of racial purity
Mm,
and genetic purity. So it's very much with us today. So this story, um, it keeps coming back in different forms. And that's part of what you said about, this sort of this urge within us to sort of like make difference. And that's part of what I tell particularly my students who are interested and concerned about issues of racial justice. Um, and I say, I'm supportive. I think it's a good thing to be concerned with, but I also say, it's a never-ending battle,
right.
right? It's not like it's a problem you ever solve. It never, it's always been with us, and you just have to keep, keep with it. And it's like, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing with it's the price of racial justice. Or for the youngsters, I tell them that I had my Harry Potter reference, which is Mad Eye Moody, who says constant vigilance, and that's sort of what it is. If you're concerned about these issues, it's tiring, right? Because it's just like it keeps coming back.
And for me, I mean, this is part of what the IM approach is about. Is I'm not going to judge that. I want to understand it. I don't condone it. I don't have to like it, but I want to understand it. And because if we dismiss those folks, aren't we in some ways just mirroring what they do to other folks? So
Yeah.
so I want to understand it. Again, I'm not condoning it at all, and I agree with you. It is one of the darker sides of who we are as human beings. It really is, but it's
Yeah. Well, and
so
very much.
hard.
Oh, sorry.
No, no, go on.
Yeah. No. One of my big concerns. I mean, again, I wrote this book. Um. Uh. Um. In the early 20s, right? The sort of during the Biden administration, if you
But also
will. But
during COVID, right? Yeah.
yeah, and also during it started.
Right.
Yeah, also during
I know you
COVID.
speak about
Absolutely.
COVID in the
Oh
epilogue.
yeah, I will
We'll
get to that in a
we'll get
second.
to
And
that. We'll get
but
to
I was
later on. Yeah, but
yeah,
go
I
on.
was just going to say is that one of my concerns has been, I mean, I consider myself, a progressive person, right? Sort of like, I don't, make any bones about that. But one of my concerns has been that, well, what I consider to be well-meaning progressives often also fall into traps. There is part of the story is sort of, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And a
Right.
lot of people who are trying to use these categories, like, in my, what I was talking earlier about trying to diversify clinical trials, for example, they're trying to do good, but also inadvertently reinforce very dangerous ideas about the relationship between race and biology. And it's
Right.
like, and I certainly don't want to condemn them. I want to engage them and help them sort of try to understand, right, more the implications of how they're characterizing these issues.
Yeah. And it really is in the understanding of this and being able to listen to each other, being able to respect, look again at why we do what we do, who we are, without that judgment. And what I'm really fortunate is, you talk about diversity. We have the most diverse group of sponsors. And what's wonderful about them is that they really do support us in every way. So with that in mind, let's take a listen to them, and we'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show. And we are back. Thank you, sponsors, for your support. We'll be hearing from you guys again later on, but now we're going to continue with Jonathan Kahn. We're in the middle of this really important discussion, looking at race, how it's become entangled in law, politics, and biology. His latest book. Jonathan, how do people get your book, first of all?
Oh, well, so I mean, you can buy it directly from Columbia University Press, .com, I guess. I don't know, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a .com, so it's a press, but Columbia University Press, it's in, a variety of bookstores, but and and other online, I think bookshop.org, places like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people really get it. It's remarkable, and it's well referenced. It's a solid foundation. But again, it's this idea, folks, that, you know, let's remind ourselves we're one group. It's called humanity. We're one group, and yet we keep going back to this bias. And sadly, it's been reinforced recently. It's always, it's always been there under the surface, but now it's reemerging. So you were talking offline about a story about Ralph Taylor. Can you
Yeah.
bring
Yeah.
that?
So this is just, it's a quirky little story that I think is a nice example of how these concepts get entangled. And this is back from, I found this story. It's from 2009. Just a regular guy, a guy named Ralph Taylor, lived in Linwood, Washington State. It's an insurance contractor. Um, and, um, and he tells this story about how one day he was in a bar and he was talking to what he characterized as a visually Caucasian guy.
Hmm.
And this guy was telling him how he got a lot of money through state contracts by claiming to be a minority. And Ralph also, was trying to get state contracts. He would try, arrange insurance contracts for big construction projects and stuff. So he thought, oh, that sounds likely. But Ralph always thought of himself as white. But he had recently taken one of these direct to consumer DNA, ancestry tests, which at that, back in 2008, 2009, they were still kind of crude, but he took one and it said, oh, well, part of it said that he had 4% what they called sub-Saharan ancestry. So 4% he would call himself black. So he said, okay, I'm going to apply to the state office for minority business contracting to get certified so I can get preference for some of these, minority set aside contracts. And the state gives it to him, but then he also wants to get certified for federal contracts because that's where the real money is. So he submits the same information, essentially arguing that he's black based on this DNA ancestry test. And because the federal guidelines actually are a little more strict and allow the office, they say, if you have any doubts, you should question the person. And so they did, and they said, we need more certification from you than just this test, and that you think, that you're claiming to be black, because the federal guidelines actually require you to have held yourself out for a period of time publicly to sort of like, live the life of a minority person. And he never had. So he gets denied it and he's upset. So he sues because that's what we do. And so it goes to court and he loses. They say, the federal guidelines are very clear. There's no evidence that you ever held yourself out or suffered any hardship. That's part of the requirement. You need to have, held yourself out and suffered some hardship by reason of society's association of you with this group. So he loses, but then he appeals. It's in federal court. He appeals up to what's called the circuit court. And in the interim, and this is one of my favorite things, in the interim, he joins the NAACP and subscribes to Ebony magazine to sort of make it seem like, okay, I'm really black now. And he goes to California and gets the California state authorities to amend his father's birth certificate, which characterized his father as Caucasian, and amend it to say Black, Native American, and Caucasian, just based on this genetic test. And California birth certificate people, they don't have any criteria. They're happy to do that. And so he brings this up, and the court says, "Yeah, nah, this is not convenient." I mean, the court's taking a very common sense view, and they see what Ralph's trying to do. And to their credit, they give a very serious consideration about these sort of genetic claims. But they're saying, it's just not there. It's not enough. What the court is doing is it's keeping separate these claims about sort of the genetic basis of his claim to race versus the social purpose of the minority set-aside program. The minority set-aside program has nothing to do with biological race. It has to do with trying to make up for historical injustices that shut minority people out of access to federal contracts. And it's
Mm,
trying to compensate to that. That has nothing to do with biology.
mm.
So after this, Ralph gets very upset and he sort of starts becoming a darling of right-wing talk shows because now instead of saying that he was wrongfully denied um, access to these contracts because he really is black, he's saying, oh, the concept of race itself is arbitrary and capricious. It's meaningless. And he starts bringing this argument that other conservative people are beginning to develop at this time is that because, you have all these liberals saying, oh, race is only a social construct. That's sort of what I was saying at the beginning, right? It's only social, only social. And what they're saying is like, oh, well, what you're really saying is because it's social, it's really not real, right? And these categories are incoherent and shouldn't provide the basis for any laws, right? Any practices like affirmative action or anything like that. And so, because
Because
what's
because
really
we've
real
made it
is
up,
science.
right? Because
What's
we've
really
made it
real
up,
is my genetic DNA test.
right? Because there's the social we made this up, this race thing,
Right. And the idea is like, oh, because it's social, it's not real. And it's like, well, I mean,
Mm.
money is social, but it's kind of real.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, a piece of paper that says 100 on it and has Ben Franklin's, um, picture on it doesn't mean, isn't anything but a piece of paper, but it's pretty real when you're trying to buy something with it.
Because we've all agreed to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've agreed on what currency means. So
Yeah.
how did so basically he was saying that the race thing was made up?
Uh, yeah, because it's not as real as genetics, which he says is sort of like genetics is what's real, but social race is just made up. Therefore, we should do away with affirmative action altogether. So he goes from trying to take advantage of affirmative action to trying to get rid of it altogether. Right? He tried to use
Mm.
genetics to try to game this system, which was a socially based system. And then he tries to just sort of use genetics then to sort of contrast with social race to say, because social race isn't as real as this genetic stuff, we should just get rid of it altogether. And we shouldn't be allowed to do any programs to help anybody based on social race.
Dismissing the inequities that have happened for
Yes,
generations.
exactly. Saying those, but yeah, exactly. And part of this is about erasing history.
Yes.
And that's part of, and again, we see that again very much today about trying to erase history. And it's also, I mean, this goes back to my previous book about implicit bias, but also about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. I mean, I know, there are a lot of people, just about anybody who works anywhere has been through some sort of diversity training, and I'm actually quite sympathetic to people who find some of these training sessions, or have found them historically, really annoying,
Mhm.
and alienating. And in part because a lot of these training programs, to my mind, were about trying to make people, they're all about sort of like getting people to look at themselves, to analyze themselves. And like a work setting, that's not a place for therapy, right?
No.
And
Well,
and people resent it.
except in my work setting, John,
Right,
like the
exactly,
psychiatrist,
right. But
right?
I mean, and people resent being sort of coerced into that
Yeah.
mindset. What studies have shown is that more effective diversity training programs are not about trying to get people to acknowledge their own biases.
Mm,
That just creates a backlash. What's effective is teaching them history,
yeah.
saying, "Oh, I didn't realize that for decades in the 20th century, from the 1920s to the 1960s, there was redlining going on in mortgage markets so Black people couldn't get loans to buy homes. And as a result of that, Black people today have much less generational wealth than white people simply because the way most people built up historically generational wealth was through access to homes, through their home. That's their biggest investment. Black people were shut out of that market for decades. And so today, there's that disadvantage. And learning about that changes the way people think. I mean, that's an example of what people would call structural racism.
Yeah.
But that changes the way people think about how society works. And that's a much sort of, and then they get to change, they get to work on themselves if they want. They're not being coerced into it.
I'm just curious, why do you think that happened at all? Why were we doing this redlining? Why were we peripheralizing certain quote races? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I very, very big question. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a funny thing because I mean, people talk. I talk more about this in my Race on the Brain book, but people talk about that it is natural for people to see differences, which it is.
absolutely
But the
is.
thing is like what type of differences make a difference?
Yeah, yeah,
And historically, I mean, you go back a couple thousand years, racial differences were not the differences that made a difference. Simply because, you know, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, whatever, the difference you were concerned about was the tribe over the next hill.
that's right.
It wasn't people from halfway around the world.
Yeah.
And they were different. And and maybe you sort of like had a sense of cohesion and protection among your tribe, and the other tribe were enemies. They were different. They were barbarians, right? That's a Greek word. So the Greek barbarians, or anybody who wasn't Greek was a barbarian. Um, but it wasn't racial. But really, I mean, what scholars of the history of racism talk about really is racism emerging. There's sort of two strands of it, but sort of emerging in, the early Middle Ages, anywhere from like 1200 to 1400. A lot of people connect it with the Age of Discovery when European explorers, came to the New World. Um, but also, and then out of that grows the phenomenon of slavery. Um, One of my undergraduate professors, who was a wonderful historian of colonial America, named Edmund Morgan, wrote this book about in America this paradox. He called it American Slavery, American Freedom, which is one of our sort of founding paradoxes. We're founded a country founded on this ideal of freedom, but also slavery, and looks at how originally when the settlers first came to this country, um, uh, they they did try to sort of some of them tried to enslave Indians, and that didn't work so much because Indians had um, um, resources, right? They had places to go to escape to. And then they had indentured servants who were, just poor Englishmen, um, and who'd come over and they'd be forced to work for you for 7 years, but then you'd be free.
Yeah,
And they were getting all these free, and they had to do something to stop the proliferation of all these poor free white people. So they started bringing over black people from Africa and enslaving them. And it was only with that move they had to sort of justify the subjugation of another person based on their race. And it's out of the need to justify mistreating this group that the ideas of racism really develop as a kind of post hoc justification for exploiting this group.
and this, the justification, the slavery and the freedom. And I know this is not necessarily a great segue, but we are a little bit enslaved to the timing of our commercial breaks. So our sponsors have the freedom to tell us what's going on with them. So with that in mind, Larry, out there in the studio, let's take a break. We'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show. We are back, the Dr. Joe Show, Jonathan Kahn, and we're talking really about some stuff, folks, that we all are involved with. We all notice differences in each other. We all notice differences in ourselves. But if we can respect the differences in each other instead of judging them, that's going to be much more powerful. You guys know, when is the last time you got angry at someone treating you with respect? I mean, you just don't, because the brain doesn't activate that way. But that doesn't mean that we need to be afraid of people's differences. One of my other phrases, every friend was once a stranger. Think about that. Every friend was once a stranger, which means we have potentially billions of friends in the world. So, Jonathan, let's get back to this discussion, but let me ask you one of the first of the two truths. The
Sure.
IAM basically is saying that, you know, we are always doing the best we can, influence and responding to the four domains. Your home domain, no one's going to argue your home has had an influence on who you are. And then the social domain, which is the rest of the world. Then the two internal domains, the biological domain of your brain and body. Are you hungry, tired, digesting lunch? We're talking about genetics. And then the I see. How do I see myself? How do I think other people see me? Human beings are very interested what other people think or feel. We call that empathy. But what we really want to know is what are you thinking about me? And that is absolutely what we're talking about tonight. But because these four domains interact, a small change can have a big effect. We don't need to change everything. So, Professor Kahn, given our topic tonight, what small change can you recommend to our listeners?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I really urge on people, I mean, this is particularly when I'm talking to people in medicine and biology, but I think it's a general thing to keep in mind, is to engage the world with a measure of intellectual humility and just humility generally, but um, but particularly when I'm talking to people about race and genetics and law, is to realize that uh, you know, for instance, if I'm talking to a geneticist, genetics is hard, right? It's hard to understand. It takes a lot of work, and I appreciate that. But understanding race is also hard. And I think for everybody, I think we all feel that like, oh, well, we know what race is. We see it every day. And at one level, that's absolutely true. But also understanding the experience of race, both current lived experience, but also the historical experience of race and racism is very fraught and complicated and contested. It's difficult. And nobody has all the answers, but in dealing with issues of race and racism, to have a measure of humility and to realize that dealing with these issues, there's no easy answers. And if you are concerned about issues of racial equity or generally issues of justice, it's just something that you always need to work at.
Yeah. So that small change is being humbled.
Yeah.
You know what it just occurred to me. I don't know why it hasn't occurred before. We'll get to the second truth in a minute. But just the word race in and of itself and the other meaning of it, right? That
Yeah.
it's a competition, that somehow there's going to be a winner and a loser, and you need to race. One of my guests was talking about the story of the tortoise and the hare. And who really wins that? Not the one who goes faster, but the one who is more methodical, slower, and aware of their surroundings. So, folks, just think about that for a moment. It's not a race. We don't need to compete with each other all the time. Cooperation can get us way further than competition. You know, did that make any sense at all?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it is, it's very much about reaching out and connecting and communicating. Um, but and also um, a willingness to sort of question your own sort of basic assumptions,
Yeah, and your
right? And so,
perspective.
like, oh, maybe I should just realize that this is different. I just want to be open to questioning yourself.
Right, and it doesn't need to be based on guilt and shame. If you think you're
No.
doing something wrong, you are going to be defensive. But it is always interesting to try to understand somebody else's perspective,
Yeah.
and to wonder about it.
Yeah, and that's why I talk about it in terms of humility. It's just realizing that, I want to be open to other points of view about this.
Yeah.
And I want to be curious.
Yeah. 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 So this the second truth of the I am. Everyone's got one. Everyone is interested through their I see domain, what you think or feel about them. And that's going to have an effect on their biological domain. Because it feels different when you feel respected or disrespected.
Yeah.
And you are part of someone's home or social domain. So the second truth of the I am, you control no one, but you influence everyone. And you get to choose the kind of influence you want to be. Professor Jonathan Kahn, professor of law and biology, author of The Uses of Diversity, How Race Has Become Entangled in Law, Politics, and Biology, and other books. What kind of influence do you want to be?
Um, Again, I suppose it sort of comes back to what I was saying about, opening people up, um, getting them to be, I don't want to just sort of repeat what I said for the first one about the humility, but um, I want to be, um, well, it's funny. I mean, I guess this is separate from the book, I guess, but when I'm teaching law students, it's like I feel like, it's not that hard to teach the basics of law. What I want to do is you know, help the students become lawyers who are just, sort of basically using the law decently, right?
Mm, yeah,
It's like using it in a way that, again, that is thoughtful and considerate, right? Which you don't often associate those concepts with practicing law, but it can be done that way. Um, and so I mean, I guess it's something along those lines.
but the combination of law and biology, I'm just curious, how has that influenced you learning both of those
So
huge
yeah,
disciplines?
yeah. So that I mean, that's in some ways that's a story for a whole other show.
Okay, we'll do it. We'll do it.
But basically, I mean, it is giving me insights, and I want to give people insights into these pervasive concepts that just surround us in everyday life about how we talk about human difference and
Yeah,
also how we talk about human hierarchy, right? Difference. And is it possible? How can we recognize difference without difference being made into a basis for elevating some group over another group?
right, right. I agree. And that is absolutely what the I am is also saying. We all want the same thing. We just want to feel valued by someone else. Think about every person you've ever met. And would you say it's true that in some ways the law is all based on one group, person, or entity devaluing someone else? And then there has to be some restitution. Is that fair that pretty much all laws are about one group devaluing someone else and we need to change that?
Well, I mean, law is, basically speaking, I mean, law does lots of different things, right? And
Yeah.
but where you have law as a redress for injury between one person and another, right? That's where the question is, has one person been mistreated by another, and the law can, does the law provide some avenue, a sort of structured avenue of recompense for that? A way that sort of, so that you're not just sort of like taking personal revenge and creating a cycle of revenge, right? Law, part of the sort of like people think of the origins of law as a way to sort of like break that cycle where you have the state or some authority, rectifying the balance when there's been an injustice. Um, so, that's one aspect, one critical aspect of the law. I mean, law does also all sorts of other things too, but
There's so many things. But was there anything else that you wanted to touch on? I mean, there's really so much in this. It really is an important topic. Was there
yeah, I
something
mean,
else that
well, one of the things was just again the example of COVID.
yeah,
When COVID hit, one of the things I noticed, well, two things happened, and one is something that has happened with epidemics for centuries, which is they become racialized. Um, you know, I mean, going back to the plague in the Middle Ages, people would call it this, the French would call it the Spanish disease, the Italians would call it the French disease, and so
Mhm.
forth,
Right.
Um, but um, uh, but so in the early months of COVID, people were making these arguments about how, oh, it's affecting, black people differently from white people, or vice versa. And there all this look at a lot of people were trying to find racial difference, and there really wasn't any to speak of. I mean, originally a lot more in the US, a lot more black and Hispanic people were coming down with COVID in the early months, but that's because they were the essential workers,
Mm.
right? And they lived in crowded housing and they took public transportation because of the overlap of race and economic status. And meanwhile, in Central Africa, or in Sub-Saharan Africa, rates of COVID were much lower and severity was lower. But people were saying, "Oh, there must be something about black people that makes them more susceptible." But so that was one thing that happened that I noticed, which eventually took about a year, but it was like thoroughly debunked. But everybody was looking for genetic bases. All sorts of different genes were being looked at to try to find a basis for why black people might be experiencing COVID differently from white people. There was none. But the other thing was in the development of vaccines, which really was the development of the mRNA vaccines for COVID was like one of the great miracles of modern medicine. It happened so fast. Um, but in conducting the vaccine trials, there emerged what I call a diversity panic, because this is where the language of diversity totally suffused the drive to enroll people into clinical trials for vaccines. Because for vaccine trials, you need a lot of people, um, usually 30 or 40,000 people per trial. And so Moderna and Pfizer each are enrolled between 30 and 40,000 people, which is huge for a clinical trial. But Moderna even paused their clinical trial at one point because everybody was saying, including people from like Congress, were saying you've got to diversify your trials, meaning you've got to enroll more black and brown people in your clinical trials. And there were odd reasons for this. The main reasons given were, one, well, black people historically have exhibited what's called vaccine hesitancy. Means that's not that they don't get vaccinated at the same rate as white people, but there is a wariness, right? Which is well-earned wariness given the mistreatment that black people have experienced at the hand of the American medical establishment over the years, like
Right.
Tuskegee and things of that
Right.
sort. Um, the other reason, so one of the reasons was, well, we want to enroll black people so black people will trust the outcome. That was just about trust. That had nothing to do with biology.
Mm.
But the other idea was, well, we want to enroll black people because we want to make sure it works in black people.
Mhm.
And the thing is
And that's an
no
assumption, right?
vaccine.
Isn't
Well,
that
sorry?
isn't that a horrible assumption to say we want to be sure it works in black people? Is that they're
Right. Well,
somehow
I mean,
different?
on the one hand, right, it's like, oh, it sounds like it's well-meaning, right? We want to make
Oh,
sure that this helps black people as much as it helps white people.
but it
But
perpetuates
but
the
it's
difference.
premised on an idea that black people are
Right.
somehow different from white
Right.
people biologically.
Right.
And
Right.
especially when, because when I started looking into this
Yeah.
and I started reading, the medical literature about this, no vaccine has ever shown differential efficacy or safety based on race.
Yeah.
I mean, vaccines don't work in some people, and some people have bad side effects from vaccines, very small numbers. But it has nothing to do with race. But this is where the idea of, race and biology were getting horribly entangled, but they
Mhm.
were getting entangled not because of race and biology, but because of the social meanings of diversity,
Mm.
right? Because the idea is, well, we have this social or political desire to address social inequities in race, but the way it manifests is by making race seem like it's biological.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's just all
Interesting.
terribly mixed up. And I mean, one of the things that I talk about this a little bit in the book, and it even became more pronounced after the book came out. after I finished writing the book. It was, I mean, in 2024. But is the thing is, um, for 20 years now, it's been documented that the really vaccine hesitant group, and it's been increasing over time, is not Black people, it's Republican people.
Yep.
But nobody was
Sure
talking
know
about,
that.
oh, we need to enroll Republicans in the trial to overcome
Absolutely.
their trust issues,
That's
right?
right. Look, it's still
Be-
happening. Big time.
Because nobody thinks that Republicans are biologically different from Democrats. Although sometimes I kind of wonder. Um, but and that I think shows up how these ideas get entangled,
Yeah.
right? It's because if you're really concerned about trust in the vaccine, the person you really, because people you really want to focus on is Republicans. And the thing about Black people is originally they did explain, as the vaccine was being developed, they did display in polls a fairly high, much higher level than the average white person, of hesitancy about it. Once the vaccine was approved and being distributed, those levels went way down. But the levels of Republican vaccine hesitancy actually went up a little bit. They
Yeah.
remained constant and went up. You know, it's it is very concerning how anti-vax sentiment has. I mean, it's always been there, and I understand for a lot of people. I really understand sort of like having concerns. There have always been concerns among some people about vaccines ever since certainly for at least over 100 years. It's been well documented, but the way it's been just taking off in the last 5 years is just stunning.
And geez, what a coincidence. We have outbreaks of measles now. Huh.
Yeah,
You think there's a connection between those things? No,
I know.
probably not, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely. No.
it's
So what's
stunning.
next? What's your next book? What are you working on?
Um, well, it's a very quirky. I don't know if it's a book, if it's an article, and I'm looking at this phenomenon called weathering, which is an epidemiological term used to describe the toll that racism takes on the biological body over
Sure.
time.
That's great. Cortisol response.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. I mean, that's a classic idea of like people were first starting to notice it in cortisol and related physiological
Yep.
phenomena.
Yeah.
Heart, blood pressure, all that sort of
All
stuff.
the stuff. Cortisol is in
But
children.
now with genomics, they can measure the effects at the molecular level.
Hmm.
And they can show how things, part of what's triggering all of that, both it's a feedback loop, both triggering the cortisol response and then being affected by cortisol and other related hormones and stuff. Is you can see impacts on the genome on things called telomeres, which are the caps to the
Sure.
chromosomes,
Yeah.
and on the epigenome, which is the molecules that regulate how genes function, that are sort of like piggybacking on the DNA. And there have been developed these things called epigenetic clocks that actually measure the difference between your chronological age and your biological age.
There-
And there have been studies showing that people subjected to different forms of racism over time, actually their biological clock ages faster than people who
Makes
haven't
sense.
been exposed. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at possible recourses for that. I'm thinking of that as not just sort of people, epidemiologists look at this as a population-based phenomenon. I want to look, because we've developed these tools that allow us to measure with precision, right, at an individual level, this phenomenon. I'm looking into the possibility, it's still quite speculative at this point, of conceiving of these harms as individual harms that might be susceptible to legal recourse.
Hmm.
So I'm
Interesting.
looking at the idea of legal recourse for the harms from
But
the
again,
embodied harms of racism. It's sort of like, sticks and stones may hurt, may
right.
break my bones, but it's like, but words will never hurt me, but words will shorten my telomeres.
Right. Nice. I like
You
it.
know,
But
so
but again, the risk is that people will just lump it again into genetics and say, well, that group, is more susceptible because they've got weaker genes, as opposed to
I think
saying
there's
that,
always going to be
right,
that danger.
but as
Absolutely.
opposed
Yeah.
to the idea that everyone is susceptible to
Yeah.
stress.
Yeah.
That
Oh,
was the
well, and
right?
that's actually one of the tricky things is because everybody is, and you have to say, I mean, is there a reason, and there are some reasons sort of like historically and constitutionally, is there a reason for treating the harms induced by the stresses from racism as different from harms induced from other kinds of stress? I mean, air traffic controllers, I am sure, right, have accelerated epigenetic clocks from the kind of stress they operate under. But that might not be the kind of stress or harm that involves the same kinds of concerns about human, degrade,
Yeah.
y-
But
air traffic controllers don't feel degraded by the
right,
stress,
right,
right?
but I'm in favor of you writing it because it bolsters the argument that we're all the same. We will all respond the same way biochemically
Yeah,
to stress in our environment.
yeah,
But now there's a responsibility to a whole group of people who are perpetuating the stress response in somebody else.
yeah,
So
yeah. And
I
in
think
some
that
ways, I analogize it in a certain degree uh, to what are called toxic torts, right? So, if uh, sort of like like in the movie Aaron Brockovich, or in the movie Civil Action, that involves people who have been who biologically have been harmed by pollutants that were improperly discharged by PG&E or whatever corporation into the environment, and it caused cancer and all sorts of other things. And sort of like, the toxicity in the environment is really harmful. And, I sort of talk, and people figuratively have often talked about racism as being toxic. But I try to think about it. Try to think about that slightly more literally, as racism as a literal toxin
literal
having
toxic.
this sort of biological impact.
Absolutely. Whenever there's a discrimination against somebody else,
Yeah.
whenever a person feels devalued, it activates their limbic survival response. If I'm not valued by you, I'm at risk of being kicked out of my protective group and being lunched. So it absolutely activates that whole survival response. The first book I wrote was on manage your stress. Um, and the basic premise was the best way to decrease your stress is to help somebody else with theirs, because then you become a benefactor. And benefactors are highly prized and valued. And the more valued you feel, the less stress you're going to feel because the less thought that you're going to be kicked out of your protective group. We're social animals, right?
Yeah.
And that's what drives us. And the idea that one social animal is still stuck in kicking out another social animal from their group. I mean, don't be surprised if that other group is going to do the same. That's been my thesis all along. The best way to manage your stress is to help somebody decrease theirs. You know, so it'll be interesting. I think it's a
Yeah.
great idea to look at it. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Much more to discuss, folks. Thanks so much for listening tonight. Professor Kahn, it's been a great discussion. We'll have you back to have much more. Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
Joe.
Thanks, everyone. Okay.